When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: Old Tom. User: LL13. Posted September 3rd, 1998.
You know how they say societies use their legends as a way to warn their kids off doing stupid things? Like how stories about an ice monster are really just a way to make sure everyone grows up knowing that playing on the lake in winter alone is a bad idea. That's how people in my town talk about the pecan groves east of city limits. Go walking in the pecan alone and old Tom will get you, they always said. He'd come from the corner of your weaker eye so you wouldn't know he was there until it was too late, until he had swept you up in his big leather duster and carried you away to hell. Growing up, I didn't really think much of the stories. I've always been the contrarian type, and while kids would go missing, sure, I figured there were plenty of explanations without having to resort to magical bullshit. A kid going off into the woods on their own made them a target, even in a fairly small town like ours because of its proximity to the highway. All kinds of weirdos could roll through, snatch a kid, and be on their way before anyone was the wiser. For most of my life, my family didn't live near the groves, and even if we had, I wasn't the outdoorsy type, so the chances of me being yanked into someone's car were pretty slim. In my sophomore year of high school, we moved across town and I had to change schools. It wasn't the worst thing that could happen. The staff at the old one were notorious for turning a blind eye to bullying, and I had the shit kicked out of me more than once. In my new school, Lafayette, that wasn't a problem, and I actually started to make friends. Ryan, Chris, Ellen, and her sister Trish would invite me to hang out with them, usually over at a house belonging to the boyfriend of Brian's mom. He worked in a mining camp up north and didn't mind his place being used as an informal clubhouse so long as there was no mess. The first time those guys brought up old Tom, I thought they were kidding. I snorted, waiting for everyone to join in on the laughter, except none of them did. Come on, I'd say, you guys don't actually believe in that story. Ellen explained it wasn't just a story. The track field at Lafayette bordered on the groves, she said, and when the girls' soccer team was out practicing or the football team was running scrimmage, you could sometimes see old Tom watching from the trees. Okay, so he's a pervert, I said. I can believe that a lot more easily than I can ghost. Ellen looked away, and Trish picked up where she left off. Our mom used to go to our school, and she says he would watch them too. If she thought that was going to convince me, she was mistaken. Okay, I countered, so he's an old pervert. Of the four friends, Chris was the one who typically said the least. He was one of those guys who was so smart, it was easier for him not to talk. Even though we hadn't all been hanging out long, I'd come to realize that if he thought something was important enough to say, it was worth listening to. It made what he said next so much harder to take in. He's a ghost. I stared at him. He went on. Or something, whatever he is, he's not a real person. Before I could vocalize my doubts, Chris held up a hand as if to say, "Let me finish." When I was a kid, I liked to walk around town on my own. I was bored at home and preferred to explore. I'd be gone for hours before my folks even noticed. They told me the same stories everyone here hears, to watch out for old Tom. Like you, I thought it was bullshit, even at that age, and since the Groves were the one place in town I hadn't explored, eventually I found my way out there. It was so quiet among the trees, like being in your own world. I was so taken with it all that when he suddenly turned up at my left side, not having made a sound, I jumped. He was a tall man, skinny, wearing a big black hat and heavy duster. Everyone says he's scary, but I didn't feel that way. He was friendly, and I thought he was cool, like a cowboy or something. He asked if I wanted to see something crazy, something that no one else in town has ever seen, and I just went with him. All the stranger danger stuff didn't make a dent because he didn't seem dangerous. We'd only gone maybe a dozen steps when I heard someone call my name, a familiar voice that turned out to be my Aunt Melissa. I turned to look and saw her waving at me from a footpath 100 yards or so away. When I turned back to the man to tell him who I was saying hi to, he was gone. There wasn't enough time for him to get away. The brush wasn't thick enough to hide in. He'd vanished. Ever since then, I've wondered where he would have taken me. If there really is something he could have shown me beyond our town, or if I would have just gone missing with the others. I guess I'll never know. I don't think Chris was shining me on. He wasn't that kind of guy, and since we all stayed friends until high school ended, I have to assume someone would have told me if he was. No, he was as sure about the supernatural nature of his story as I was that the sun would rise in the morning. Some societies use legends to teach their kids valuable lessons about the natural world, and some, I guess, really do have an old Tom out there waiting in the trees for someone to wander away alone.
Subject, Burning Bright. User, TexOldster. Posted May 13th, 1994.
The older I get, the recollections from my childhood feel less like memories of my own and more like scenes from an old movie I might have once watched while falling asleep on the couch. Faces become fuzzy and indistinct. Voices fade, and worst of all, the gaps between memorable events just keep getting wider. I read somewhere that the people in our lives are like external memory banks who hold on to the things we can't retain by ourselves, but I don't have many of those either. My parents had me late after their own parents had passed, and my son Corey died in an industrial accident around 10 years ago. Most days, I feel completely separated from my past, but every now and then, something will unlock a small flood of things I thought were gone forever. It can be a smell, or a sound, or a song, or sometimes just a name that does the trick. This morning, when I was going through the Star-Telegram after breakfast, it was an obituary for Toots Mansfield that brought memories back to me, one of which I feel is appropriate for being told here. Mr. Mansfield was a cowboy and a gentleman, a Texas icon who ran the state's first ever rodeo school and happened to be the only person my father ever looked up to. He traveled a long way to learn from Mr. Mansfield, arriving with enough money for school but nowhere to stay, and so the family was good enough to let him camp on their land. Dad was always working a lot when I was little, but when he was there to put me to bed, he'd always talk about how he'd had the best sleeps of his life beneath a canopy of stars. He'd say, "Do you know how much I love those stars, Billy?" I was supposed to ask him, "How much, Daddy?" Then he'd say, "So much that I took one away with me when I left because I couldn't stand to be without them. And do you know what I did with that star?" Then I'd ask, "What'd you do, Daddy?" And he'd say, "I brought it home to your mother and we put it in the crib. When we came back in the morning, you were there waiting for us. That's why you're my star." I loved when he would say that to me. As I got older, my father told me more stories about life after learning his trade, and they were not all so pleasant as the one I just shared. There was one in particular that was downright out of this world, and if it hadn't been him who had told me, I'd never believe it. To set the scene, this took place one night in Central Texas, sometime in the early 1950s. My father was working as an itinerant laborer. They used to have a term for it, but I can't recall what it was, and he was between jobs, camping out under the stars he'd loved so much. His camp was maybe 100 yards from an arroyo that ran off into the distance where it disappeared from view behind a rise. Dad was woken from a dead sleep by what he described as the sound of my horse fussing, which he never elaborated on, but I took to mean it was whinnying and stomping around. He got up from his bedroll expecting to see a coyote or some such thing creeping around in the dark, but there was nothing in the immediate area. Dad stood there, listening to the wind for 10, maybe 15 minutes before he saw a yellow glow in the distance. He said it cast a halo around the little hillock that hid the arroyo like car headlights, except there was no way a car could have been all the way out where he was, and if there had been a car, Dad reasoned, he'd have heard it long before it was visible. The yellow light soon grew, as if it was coming up the wash, and Dad, his curiosity, well and truly piqued, decided he wanted to get closer. He remembers the stars seeming to glow even brighter in the sky, as if there were 10,000 eyes focused down on him. His footfall was barely audible on the dirt, and despite the rapidly approaching light, the desert wind was still the only thing he could hear. Stepping down into the arroyo, Dad said he'd started to feel a vibration, as if he'd stepped on a platform ahead of an approaching train. In addition, the moment the vibration began, the wind seemed to die away, and the difference was so shocking that Dad stepped back out of the empty riverbed. As soon as he did, the vibration disappeared, and the wind was audible again. He was torn. Should he head back to camp or keep moving forward into whatever phenomenon he was observing? Dad being Dad, he decided to press on, headlong into the unknown. The vibration and eerie silence became unremarkable after a few minutes, and he had almost become accustomed to the experience when he finally came around a bend and encountered the source of the glow. If it hadn't been my father telling me the story, I'd never believe it, but he was a serious man, not given to tall tales, which is what made our little bedtime storytelling ritual so much more special. According to Dad, what he saw in front of him was a blackened human skeleton trudging steadfastly forward, a brilliant yellow fire burning in its chest. The reflected glow lit its empty orbital sockets up with an unearthly awareness, and he knew that the skeleton had not only seen him, but was aware of him. It didn't seem to care about him, however, or regard him with any interest. It merely continued lurching forward, step after step, its nature and purpose unknown. As it got closer, Dad expected to feel the heat of the skeleton's fire, but the opposite was true. Instead of heat, he felt cold, terrible, heart-stopping cold, like falling into icy water. It leached his own heart, pulling the warmth from him, and the nearer it drew, the more certain he became that to stay where he was meant risking death. Dad stepped back out of the arroyo, and the cold was gone as quickly as the wind returned. The glow remained, but the thing which caused it was gone, as if you could only see it if you traveled the same path. Dad stood there watching the ball of light until it disappeared over the horizon, then walked back to camp. He rolled a cigarette and stood there smoking until his heart slowed down enough for him to get back in bed. He had no understanding of what he'd seen and never would, but as he lay there on the ground, he took comfort in seeing the stars above him burning bright.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.